If you had been following Gray Zone Warfare since its early access launch, you might think it was yet another extraction shooter destined to die in Escape from Tarkov's shadow. But then this happened. That's right, this is a 2-year-old early access game currently outperforming a major extraction shooter by Bungie, and it's outlived many games that launched and died in less time. Now, I'll admit I always struggled to try and get into the Tarkov gameplay loop, but when Gray Zone Warfare came along, it felt like it was bringing enough newness to the genre where all of a sudden I became interested. It made some really basic but also innovative changes to the genre. Instead of loading into timed raids on isolated maps and having to spend half of your play session just doing inventory Tetris, Gray Zone dropped players into a seamless open world where you're part of an ongoing operation that never sleeps. You move around the map by helicopter, you deploy into a persistent environment with a full day-night cycle, and now it even has ever-changing weather. Yet, despite its amazing graphical presentation and innovative ideas, Gray Zone struggled with player retention. It's an extraction shooter without the endgame. And in this genre, well, the endgame is pretty much everything. That's the part that keeps people engaged for dozens if not hundreds of hours after they finish the early and mid-game content. And Gray Zone's endgame has always been supposed to be at least this ground zero area, and it's not being fleshed out until the 1.0 update, so players have essentially had this early access game with no real preview of the end gameplay loop. And it looks like it could still be at least 1 to 2 years away, which seems kind of crazy. That's a very long early access period. So why did this 0.4 Spearhead update for the game bring the player base back in with such a major boost? It's predominantly a visual overhaul to the game's world with a bunch of new content and a bunch of quality of life improvements. And yet, without solving the game's biggest problems, it still brought the game's player count back up to levels that it hadn't seen since launch, and it seems to be holding those levels, well, 2 weeks later, which is impressive. And on the very surface level, I think that says something important. Players haven't given up on Gray Zone Warfare. There was a lot of people who bought into the early access concept of this game, quickly realized it was nowhere near done, and sort of shelved it. But that doesn't mean that players don't want this game to succeed. The audience is there, the interest is there, people want to see what the full world of Gray Zone ends up becoming. So with that said, let's dive into the 0.4 update, and I want to talk about some of my favorite things from the update and also some of the areas where the game is still clearly very much lacking. Spearhead might not be that monumental patch that fixes everything about Gray Zone, but it's not small either. The developers have gone back and reworked basically every part of the existing world. Every major location has gotten a noticeable facelift. Interiors have been revamped, new environmental assets have been added all over the map, and more than 25 new points of interest have been introduced to make previously underdeveloped areas feel much more connected and worth exploring. On top of that, the update adds new guns, hundreds of new weapon parts, AI improvement, updated loot, improved vendors, new animation systems, and a new tutorial that, well, it honestly feels a bit unnecessary. One of the best new things that really stood out to me, aside from the graphics update, is the improved tactical map and mission tracking system. A lot of games try to forego some of that heavy-handed coordinate systems, which I can appreciate, and they do this in favor of clues and directions. But I think Gray Zone is starting to figure out that players are here to hunt NPCs and other players, not comb through text and map coordinates in the middle of a complex and dangerous environment. Now, the game had a progression wipe, and it's forced me to rerun all the missions all over again, and I had a pretty good opportunity to kind of compare the old system with the new one, and the change is a huge quality of life improvement. Even in the starter areas where I was more or less pretty familiar with everything, being able to just look at the map and immediately see the approximate locations of multiple active missions made planning routes just so much easier. At a glance, I could tell whether I should push a little bit further, knock out 1 or 2 nearby tasks, or if I really did need to return to base and do a resupply before moving on. And this new system becomes even more valuable once you're beyond that starting area. Early faction areas are pretty isolated, so you don't run into enemy players very often. But once you start pushing additional locations that multiple factions actually share and fight over, everything gets way more chaotic. You're juggling mission objectives, AI enemies, possible enemy player encounters, and of course unfamiliar terrain, so you just don't even know what you're walking into. And in that context, the new radius system is a major improvement because it lets you just focus more on surviving and informed exploration instead of constantly cross-referencing vague map coordinates in a map screen that just takes your attention away from actually, well, not dying. That said, there's still plenty of quality of life features that are very much lacking here, such as a shared squad progression. If you and your friends are all on the same mission, you still have to complete the objectives individually. This becomes comically obnoxious when missions require you to, say, kill a specific NPC and then the party is forced to wait around for that NPC to respawn. It basically encourages solo play, which I don't think the devs are trying to do here, and basically any other multiplayer shared quest system game has had this technology for decades at this point, so Grayzone really needs to get on top of this. And honestly, it can be even worse if you're solo and another random player kills the target before you do, and then you get there and there's frankly nothing to do on your mission. Now, I want to talk about some of the visual improvements. In past videos, I've said that this is one of the best looking tactical FPSs that I've ever played, but Spearhead makes the world visually even more impressive and readable this time around. The added detail and new locations make the game world feel more lived in and dense. Locations also have stronger visual landmarks, better signposting, and more environmental storytelling detail, which just makes it functional as a game space. A good example is the doctor's office in the starting town. Before this patch, it was easy to miss because the signage just really didn't stand out much. It felt like any other random building. Now it's a much cleaner visual identity with a bright red sign that lights up at night, which makes the location easier to spot naturally while moving through town. That kind of environmental readability matters a ton, especially in a game where players are constantly navigating under pressure and following vague mission briefings through unfamiliar areas. And while these updates might sound kind of obvious to a degree when you played Grayzone before and after this patch, the difference really does feel massive, which is why I'm trying to bring it out as such a big improvement here. Now, the performance has also improved for me quite a bit. I've seen noticeably less stuttering and much smoother frame rates. This was, again, one of the top problems with the game, and they've been making incremental improvements to this through all their patches so far. I'm still not at the point where I'd call Grayzone's optimization amazing or anything like that, but it feels so much better than it did back in the day. And given that they're still trying to render an entire jungle at an incredible high fidelity, I'm gonna give them a bit of leeway here because they are trying to take on one of the more challenging things you can do in an open game world. Now, one of the bigger topics when it comes to Grayzone's gameplay is its PvP, because ever since the last major update, and especially now, there's been this growing argument over whether the game should be more PvP driven or whether it's better off leaning into its growing PvE mission trees. And the two systems often feel at odds with each other rather than complementing one another. Conflict zones and combat outposts in particular change the entire rhythm of player conflict. Conflict zones are map markers showing a radius around any PvP conflict happening on the map. And combat outposts are basically forward operating bases that players can capture for their faction, and then they can use them as respawn points and mission sites to hand in so they don't have to actually return all the way back to their base. However, these new zones make the PvP a lot more concentrated, a little bit more contrived, and certainly less risky when it comes to messing with mission progress. In fact, it kind of trivializes it to an extent. Instead of every firefight feeling like a high-stakes, serious commitment, many of the encounters just kind of turn into these repetitive back-and-forth stalemates where players die, respawn, re-gear, and re-enter the same fight over and over and over until somebody basically gives up through sheer boredom. It kind of reminded me of a small-scale tactical version of, say, a PlanetSide 2 battle, where you're just kind of sheer willpowering your way through an incredibly repetitive firefight that seems to go on forever. And it's kind of hard to know what direction the devs should go here, because a huge part of Grayzone Warfare's future identity seems to be tied into content that still isn't developed. The Ground Zero areas, basically the endgame zone zone where all major PvP and the toughest PvE combat is supposed to happen. And apparently the devs aren't going to flesh out this area until the game moves out of early access. So it could be quite a while before we even know what this end game zone is supposed to be and how PvP and PvE is supposed to work at the very end of the day. The game is also openly inspired by Stalker, with this central zone supposed to have supernatural or anomalous elements or something like that, but so far there isn't really any of that in the game, so it's kind of weird thinking about this game having a very different vibe as it completes its content, because right now the vibe is highly tactical, crouching and stalking through jungle and town areas. And I think this is going to really be Grayzone's biggest challenge in the future, is for the devs to figure out its actual endgame loop and what they want the final experience to be like. Once you've completed the main quest and explored most of the accessible content, there isn't a strong enough incentive yet to keep players going for dozens of hours. The early and mid game are much more compelling and accessible now, and I think that's a big part of why players have come back in a big way, because before it was actually really hard to get into. Now it's much easier to get into, but they're eventually just going to hit that content limit and then they'll drop off once again as they have in the past. Fortunately though, the foundation has become much better. The world is immersive, the gameplay is strong, the structure is promising, and this 0.4 update is actually giving me a lot of faith in the developers to deliver something compelling down the road. They didn't cut and run when they easily could have. They got a lot of early access sales. Somebody could have easily just deposited that money in their bank account and called Grayzone a failure, but they stuck with it, and now they have a game that's looking like it could actually pay off in the long run. I think Grayzone has sort of nailed the core design and is already a game that does a great job of distinguishing itself from, say, Tarkov, while offering many of the similar highs and lows that make that game so compelling. If the devs can really architect a good endgame, then I think Grayzone could snowball into something much more mainstream and become a solid alternative to Tarkov. That said, there's still a lot of uncertainty around the roadmap, and it's not totally clear how closely the future updates will actually match what was originally advertised for this game. But systems like player hideouts, crafting, broader progression features, and whatever Ground Zero will eventually become all sound like the kind of super ambitious additions that could push Grayzone into a much more complete extraction experience that keeps players engaged for hopefully hundreds of hours. I'd be curious to know if you guys have been playing this latest 0.4 update and what you think about it. Why are you sticking with it longer, if you have been sticking with it longer? And also, do you think the devs are on the right path with PvE versus PvP? Do you think they should focus more on PvE and maybe restrict PvP to certain areas or incentivize it only in certain areas? What do you think is a good solution here? Because it seems to be one of the most debated topics. Now, if you want to see another work-in-progress Unreal Engine 5 game, check out my devlog for Sea-Beams, a spaceship action RPG that we're building in UE5. We're over 2 years into development, and I am very excited about where we're going with this title. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. This is Level Cap, signing off.